Hello students. आज के इस रिवीजन के सेशन में we will revise chapter Mother's Day and also the poem of photograph, right? तो चलिए शुरू करते हैं with the revision. A quick recap or a brief summary of the story to you. So the play begins with two friends having a candid conversation at Mrs. Pearson's house, and the two friends are Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Fitzgerald. They are having a very serious and sincere conversation. And Mrs. Fitzgerald, she is telling Mrs. Pearson's fortune and advises her on it. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, she tells Mrs. Pearson that it is now in her own hands that she can decide what her future will be. So Mrs. Pearson, she goes about telling how her family members don't value her and don't appreciate whatever she does for them. She's available for them 24/7, and all they do is come in, throw orders around at her, and leave without even saying thank you to her. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, she tells her to take a stand as the boss of the house. She guides her to assert her personality over the family members. But Mrs. Pearson, being the sweet and innocent lady, she does not want to bring her family any sort of discomfort. She wants to avoid any kind of unpleasantness in the house. And then Mrs. Fitzgerald, she comes up with a plan. She proposes a plan to switch their bodies so that Mrs. Fitzgerald, she takes her place without her family members knowing. That is Mrs. Pearson's family member knowing the fact that it is not Mrs. Pearson. But Mrs. Pearson, she is hesitant at first. But then Mrs. Fitzgerald, she is able to convince her. And then Mrs. Fitzgerald, she performs her magic that she had learned from the East, and their personalities are changed. So now we see that how Mrs. Pearson, Mrs. Fitzgerald is a different personality now, and thus she is no longer weak and timid there because now it is Mrs. Fitzgerald who is in the body of Mrs. Pearson. So now they have exchanged their personality, and it is at that moment that Doris Pearson, she enters the house. Doris is Mrs. Pearson's daughter, and when she enters the scene asking for tea and ordering Mrs. Pearson to iron her yellow silk, she is surprised to see her mother smoking. So she gets shocked at the sight of her mother smoking, and from there, the argument begins where Mrs. Pearson, she insults Charlie Spence. Charlie Spence, he is the boyfriend of Doris. And she goes to the extent of calling Charlie Spence as buck teeth and half witted. So Doris, she is disappointed. She becomes angry and she leaves crying. And then Cyril, her brother, that is son of Mr. and Mrs. Pearson, he enters, asking for tea and something to eat too. He too is amazed at having come home to see that there is nothing to eat and no tea to drink. And upon asking if anything is wrong, Mrs. Pearson, she tells him that she had never felt better. Cyril, he also gets annoyed, and Doris joins him, where they are told that Mrs. Pearson might even take the weekend off. So we see that how Mrs. Pearson, with Mrs. Gerald's personality, she is now dealing with the children at home. So here, Mrs. Pearson, that is Mrs. Fitzgerald, she tells the children that if they don't thank her for the work that she does, and when they talk about working 8 hours a day, she tells them that how she has finished her 8 hours day's work, and now she wanted to take a day off, and she can also take the weekend off at that moment. So the children, they are really shocked. They did not expect these kind of things from their mother because they had never seen their mother behaving in such a manner. Cyril, who had asked her mother that who asked his mother that morning to mend his clothes, he finds that even those clothes were not ready at that moment. So they are in a shocked state of mind because of the shock treatment given by Mrs. Fitzgerald. Next is the turn of George Pearson, who enters the scene and is shocked to see his wife day drinking because she was drinking stout at the moment when George Pearson he enters the house. He announces that he has some special match at the club and that he won't be requiring any tea that afternoon. So, on being told that there's no tea, he gets annoyed again. And to this, Mrs. Pearson, she tells that how has he ever tried this trick at the club? She gives an example that अगर वो किसी वेटर के पास जाकर ये कहता है कि उसे जो है आज ड्रिंक नहीं चाहिए और इस बात पर वो अनॉय हो जाता है कि वेटर ने उसके लिए ड्रिंक रेडी नहीं की है, तो किस तरह का जवाब उसे वेटर्स देते हैं, हैज़ ही एवर ट्राइड दिस? सो listening to this, George Pearson is little annoyed, he is irritated, but along with that, Mrs. Pearson, she also tells him about the names they call him at the club. And thus she taunts him and she says that how he is being made fun of at the club. People call him Pompey Pearson because of his nature of being slow and show off जो करते हैं उनकी इस आदत की वजह से people they started calling him Pompey Pearson. And she further taunts him that this would not have happened had he stayed at home once in a while. कि अगर इस तरह से वो क्लब इतना ऑफन नहीं जाता तो शायद उसे लोग इस तरह से नाम से नहीं पुकारते और उसे उसका मजाक नहीं बनाते। और वो ये इस बात का एहसास भी दिलाती हैं कि किस तरह से मिसेस पियर्सन जो है वो घर पर रहती हैं, उनका इंतज़ार करती हैं, एंड शी नेवर मेक्स हिम लुक लाइक अ फूल इन फ्रंट ऑफ एनीबडी, but he is a thankless man who never treats his wife in a proper manner, who never spends time with her, but she is always there with her husband. So, this way, we see that how Mrs. Fitzgerald, she is trying to give a shock treatment to the family members just to make them realize that how they had never given importance to the woman in the house, that is Mrs. Pearson. And then after a while, we see that how Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is real Mrs. Pearson, she enters. She interferes in their family matters. And looking at this, George Pearson, he gets annoyed when Mrs. Fitzgerald calls him by his name. And then we see how Mrs. Pearson, she defends Mrs. Fitzgerald and she barges in to bring George on track, telling him that he was not a Duke of Edinburgh, that people should call him with respect. So this way, this kind of treatment continues, and then Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is real Mrs. Pearson, she loses her cool and she asks her family members to excuse them for a moment. And she also promises them and assures them that she knows how to make the situation better and they would not regret leaving them for a moment alone. So Mrs. Fitzgerald asks Mrs. Pearson to switch their bodies, and while Mrs. Fitzgerald she resists at first, she was enjoying the situation, but later on she agrees to do it. So they repeat the process. The magic spell is again uttered by Mrs. Fitzgerald, and then the personalities they again exchange their bodies, and now we see that Mrs. Fitzgerald is real Mrs. Fitzgerald and Pearson the real one. But Mrs. Fitzgerald, she explains Mrs. Pearson that how important it is for her to be a bit dominating once in a while to establish her control and respect. So she told her again to be firm quite often with the family members, not to give any explanation or apologizes in front of the family members, which was quite important at the moment. So the family member they enter and they find Mrs. Pearson smiling. Then Mrs. Pearson, she wanted to test whether the trick played by Mrs. Fitzgerald actually worked or not. So she suggests that they should play rummy and kids they should make supper, and everyone instantly agrees to her suggestion. But they are also a bit relieved to see the mother smiling at the moment. And we see Mrs. Fitzgerald, she exits and the play ends here. So we see that how Mrs. Pearson, who in the beginning we find her in a very sympathetic situation, in a pathetic situation where we see that how she was just little more than a servant in her house, and with the help of her neighbor Mrs. Fitzgerald, she's able to we can say have her day in the house as a mother in the house, real mother who deserved love and respect and affection from the family members. And thus the shock treatment actually brought all the members right on track and they were ready to spend time with Mrs. Pearson, and they were also listening to the suggestions that she was giving at the moment. So, this is the story of the play that is Mother's Day. Right, students? And for detailed explanation, you can also refer to the video uploaded on the school YouTube channel. So, you can watch the video to have a better understanding of any part of the story if it is still not clear to you. Right, students? Now, we will revise the poem, A Photograph, written by Shirley Toulson. Right? Now, this poem, A Photograph, uh, in this poem, the poet, she remembers her mother who has died long time back. So when she sees the photograph on which the photograph which contains her mother along with her cousins, and looking at the photograph, she becomes nostalgic. She experiences great loss of her mother, and thus the poem, it talks about how death can silence things in your life, how death can leave you speechless in your life. So, in the introductory lines, we see that how the poet, when she looks at the photograph of her mother, which was taken when her mother was just 12 years old. So, she has gone for a sea holiday with her cousins Betty and Dolly, and they were paddling. Paddling means they were just walking on the beach and they were posing for a photograph to be clicked. And their uncle, they were posing there, and their uncle clicked the photograph for them. So the poet says that how the cousins, they were holding the hands of poet's mother, and her mother was the eldest among them. All of the three, they stood still, smiling for the photograph, and smiling through their hair as the wind was blowing and their hair was ruffling over their faces. So they were posing and not moving when the uncle was clicking the photograph. The poet also shares that how her mother, she had a very pretty face, she had a sweet face when she was a young girl. And she also tells us that all these have happened when she was not even born at that time. Then she talks about the footprints that were made on the sand, that the waves washed their feet. So years fled past since then, and how her mother, she has grown up into an adult, and they all have undergone changes, while the sea, it is still the same. The sea, which was at the background, it is still the same. So here the poet talks about the irony, and she compares the permanence of nature with the impermanence of human life. And the poet says that how the persons who were in the picture, they have grown up, they have undergone changes, and they have also died long time back. But the sea, which is in the background, it is still the same. The sea has not changed much here. Then the poet talks about that how after 20, 30 years later, when the photograph was clicked, after that time, the poet's mother, she would look back at the photograph and she would laugh nostalgically and remembers the past. The poet's mother, she accepted the fact with this youthful spirit. She knew that the childhood days were not going to come back again. So, how we see the youthful spirit of poet's mother, where she had accepted this bitter reality कि जो बचपन के दिन है वो अब वापस नहीं आएंगे. So she was suffering the loss of that childhood time period, the beach holiday that she had been to. She was missing those days, but she was not sad. Although she was nostalgic, but she accepted the fact in a lively way. It shows the positive outlook of poet's mother. So she would appreciate, she would talk of the dress worn by them in while they were posing for the photograph, and she would say that, look, Betty and Dolly, how they dressed us for the beach. So the poet says that the sea holiday that belonged to the past of her mother, and the laughter of her mother is the past of her life, because she remembers how her mother would laugh looking at the snapshot, and she says कि जो मेरी माँ की वो जो हंसी है अब वो मेरे पास्ट का हिस्सा बन चुकी है, क्योंकि उनकी जो माँ है वो अब जिंदा नहीं है. So she is suffering the loss of her mother. So she says that both rye with the labored ease of loss. The poet has used here the poetic device oxymoron, expressing a contradictory situation, that how they have to bear the loss with comfort, bear the loss with ease. The poet's mother, she is suffering the loss of her childhood, and the poet, she is suffering from the loss of her mother. That is, she has lost her mother and she remembers the mother's laughter here. In the concluding stanza, the poet talks about the destined fate, that how mother she has died now, she has died long time back. And talking about the circumstances of her mother's death, she says that there is nothing else left to say. The matter is closed, and it has further silenced everything in her life. This death, this silence, that which has created a silence in her life, is so overwhelming that the vacuum which is created in her life, it can never be filled. So she is missing her mother a lot, and she is nostalgic at the moment. She remembers her mother and feels that this loss cannot be recovered. She could not recover from this loss again, and there is a vacuum which cannot be filled. And thus she ends the poem saying that it's silence silences everything. So the silence that has been there in her life has silenced further everything in her life, and she says that there is nothing more to tell about mother and about her death. So this is all about the poem Photograph. Hope this poem is clear to you. And now we will have a discussion and doubt session. So revise the poem again, and we will meet next for the discussion on the questions. Thank you all.